Roger Kaye is retiring from the Fish and Wildlife Service after 45 years in Alaska as a planner, native liaison, airplane pilot, and most recently as a wilderness and Anthropocene coordinator. Roger has a PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he has taught wilderness, environmental psychology, and the Anthropocene. He is the author of the book Last Great Wilderness, the campaign to establish the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The following is one of the programs that Roger has developed over his career, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked him to record.
Well, hi, and welcome to Wilderness 101. Our purpose of this course is to help you understand what wilderness is, and we're going to emphasize the intent of the Wilderness Act, and also help you be able to respond to this question: why do we have wilderness? Well, in this condensation of what should be a semester-long class, we'll look at the history, purpose, and some of the main provisions of the Wilderness Act. Now, wilderness is a resource, but it's quite like any others that we are managers of. And for many reasons, especially the one we'll emphasize in the introduction, there are gray areas, there are ambiguities, and there are apparent inconsistencies and misunderstandings aplenty in the area of wilderness stewardship. Now, there's a lot in the Wilderness Act, and we won't attempt to cover everything, but there are four main things you should be aware of. And that is, the Wilderness Act created a national system of wilderness areas. It provided a definition of wilderness, established a process for designating new wilderness areas, and finally, the Wilderness Act set provisions for managing the use of wilderness areas. Our focus will be on number 2 and number 4, which will be most useful for you. But first, number 1, the Wilderness Act created a system, a national system of wilderness areas. Of course, the act was passed in 1964. It established 54 areas. Today, that has grown to 765 million acres. In 1964, it established 4.1 million acres of wilderness. Today, that has grown to 112 million acres. So I need to emphasize from the outset that we are discussing, our agencies only deal with what's called capital wilderness. That is, wilderness designated by Congress, defined by law with legal purposes, provisions, and prohibitions administered by one of these 4 agencies. But we do need to remember that there's another wilderness, and it's called little w wilderness, or de facto wilderness. And that's the wilderness that's often described in the literature as pristine wilderness, or virgin wilderness, or as God made it wilderness, or as Howard Zahniser jokingly said, it's where the hand of man has never set foot, which is not true at all, of course, because even the earliest wilderness founders and framers of the Wilderness Act were aware of Indigenous Americans in these landscapes and often included them in the early writings and visual representations. So this is not the wilderness that we are concerned with. This is not designated wilderness. So let's go to what wilderness is. And to learn that, we'll look at the definition of wilderness from the Act. Part 2 of the definition, and we'll look at, first, an area of wilderness generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. And you notice how qualified that is. It is not intended to be a pristine place. And as Bob Marshall, who began the wilderness movement per se, wrote, trails and temporary shelters, which were common long before the advent of the white race, are entirely permissible. In other words, nothing that the indigenous people left behind or were doing is inconsistent with wilderness. So we're going to take a look at the early wilderness proponents, those people whose ideas and idealism about nature and humans' relationship to it led to the Wilderness Act. We'll begin with Henry David Thoreau and John Muir. They represent the early transcendental writers who first espoused the various values of wild nature. We'll look at the words of Aldo Leopold and Bob Marshall, Olaus and Marty Murie, whose advocacy turned this emerging wilderness ideology, this wilderness philosophy, into a political movement for a Wilderness Act. And then we'll look at Howard Zahniser, who actually wrote the Wilderness Act that we have today. And we're going to consider the words of visitors, words that express what they come seeking and what they find in wilderness. And we'll consider why the millions of people who find satisfaction, they find inspiration, even in hope, in just knowing that wilderness is here. Now, it's the nature of some wilderness values to be rather inexplicable, like those Leopold described as values as yet uncaptured by language. And that's perhaps because they're rooted in an affinity with nature that evolved before language. So the people who first used the visually represented what was presented in the early literature on wilderness were called psychologists in canvas at the time, and they were part of the Hudson River School of Art that represented these notions of wilderness that Thoreau and Muir and others were writing about at the time. And since the time of Thoreau, in fact, art was used to give visual expression to these philosophical conceptions of wilderness. And one thing that these painters did is use a diminutive effect. And you notice how small people, these are Native Americans in this case, are in relation to the landscape. So what does this painting express to you? Think about what the painters tried to put into this landscape that represented this the literature at the time. Well, for one thing is that diminutive effect, that people are small in the larger scale of things. And another is just the brightly lit background, the influential or spiritual conception. And also in here is, painted in here, was the idea that people aren't on the earth, that are within the earth. So that's what the early artists attempted to convey about this notion of wilderness. Now, Henry Thoreau was among the first to extol the wild value of nature as being free from human control. And a generation later, John Muir drew upon the emerging ecological and evolutionary thinking, especially the implications of the common origin of all life, to preach that wilderness is particularly conducive to enable people to see themselves as not separate from, but within something more encompassing. And so we can just say that by the 1920s, the three main ideas associated with the wilderness concept were that wild nature can provide these kinds of experiences. The natural world and its inhabitants have intrinsic value. And humans are an interdependent member of a larger community of life. Radical ideas for the time. So as World War II ended, progress was rapidly transforming America. The rapid loss of natural areas, the destructive logging, mining, agricultural practices of the time, the pollution and pesticides, the awesome power and the fallout of the atomic bomb. These were among the many rapid changes that awoke many people to a new era of environmental threat. And these early ideas about wilderness and nature provided an underpinning for the emerging political movement to protect these wilderness values in some type of a federal law. So the wilderness movement was really a reaction to these post-war changes. And among the leaders at the time was Bob Marshall, early wilderness movement leader who extolled these recreational values of wilderness. But while these values of wilderness are perhaps best known today, Marshall also wrote about the area of the wilderness value of wilderness areas being free from the manifestations of human will. In other words, being left wild. And Aldo Leopold was a pioneering ecologist who soon became a leading spokesman for the wilderness movement. And of course, it was Leopold who first emphasized the scientific value of wilderness. So the wilderness concept wasn't just about preserving nature in some places, but as you can see from his writing here, it was intended to be about an attitude towards the natural world, about a sense of humility, and about a relationship to nature. And this is important to understand because that's part of what you hold in trust in wilderness. A preeminent Alaska field biologist in the 1920s through the 1940s, Olaus Murie was one of the co-authors of the Wilderness Act. Now, Murie was a scientist. He was a preeminent field ecologist in Alaska at the time. His emphasis was on wildlife and ecology. But in 1945, he left the Fish and Wildlife Service to lead the Wilderness Society, where he promoted what he saw as this larger purpose and significance of wilderness. And Marty Murie was Olaus's partner on his months-long expedition in wilderness. Those are back in the days when you could bring your spouse on your field work in Alaska. And she was his partner on the campaign to enact the Wilderness Act as well as to establish the Arctic Refuge. So this is Howard Zahniser, the author of the Wilderness Act. And this is one of his statements from the legislative history of the Wilderness Act. Critics have always said about this, well, that's nice sentiment, but you couldn't put that in law. But Howard did succeed in putting it into law. And after 8 years of political debate, we now have designated wilderness after September 3rd, 1964. And wilderness had this whole new status. And I should mention that although there were many hearings and many years that the wilderness campaign continued on, it passed overwhelmingly. In fact, the vote in the House of Representatives was 374 to 1 in favor of the Wilderness Act. So let's take a look at the Wilderness Act, the specific provisions in the Act, and we'll begin with the intent of the Wilderness Act. As it said in the preamble, the intent of the Act is to secure for the American people of present and future generations an enduring benefit of wilderness. And it's often said there's no conservation law that's more future-oriented than the Wilderness Act. And in this section of the Wilderness Act, we see that wilderness is legally described as a resource. So this idea that wilderness represents an obligation to future generations and that its benefits should be timeless was paramount. It is paramount in the refuge framers' writings and testimonies. And so we should be thinking about the value of wilderness to the children and the grandchildren of these kids in this exponentially changing AI-driven world that they will inherit. Experiences like my daughters had, just discovering wolf tracks in the mud. It was such a simple joy compared to the basketball, computer games, and TV that bound and shaped their world back in Fairbanks. But it was so much more powerful in stimulating their imagination and, perhaps leading them to discover what the framers of the Wilderness Act emphasized, and that is our relatedness to the world that we didn't make and don't control. So going back to the wording of the Wilderness Act, this phrase, wilderness character, resonates 4 times through the Wilderness Act. It is the singular, most important phrase in the Act, and it is the definition of wilderness. Anytime you see preserving wilderness character, it refers to the singular purpose of wilderness, and it is the most important of purposes. And keep that in mind. The idea of wilderness character should be in the back of your head every time you're dealing with one of those hard-to-make wilderness decisions. So let's take a look at the definition of wilderness in some detail. We'll begin with the last phrase, where man is a visitor who does not remain. This does not in any way imply that people didn't once live in wilderness, but today it's where no one resides. Wilderness is an area of the earth and its community of life. That Zahniser, who wrote the Act, borrowed that phrase from his friend Aldo Leopold. And it's interesting to note that, and it's important to note that the definition of wilderness is placed in the context of the earth. And that represents the fact that the movement leaders often place their advocacy for wilderness in this larger context of the Earth, the planet, the globe, or the universe. And the Wilderness Act is quite unique in having this kind of parlance. And so we look at wilderness as a community embodying a whole assemblage of creatures, not just for habitat for our favorite species. But as Ola said here, it's also about the real problem, and that is human species and our relationship to the Earth. So, the wilderness is for wildlife, but in an ecological context. Most importantly, the Act's framers spoke to the interrelatedness and equal value of all life forms, including the little unnoticed creatures as well as the often disliked predators. Let's take a look at that word untrammeled. Again, the key word, most important word in the Wilderness Act. What does untrammeled mean? And importantly, what does it not mean? Well, it does not refer to being an untrampled area. According to Howard Zahniser, who first used the word, untrammeled is this: not being subjected to human controls and manipulations that hamper the free play of natural forces. So, wilderness is an area being free from human intention to manage, control, manipulate, or subjugate nature for our uses and our conveniences. And this describes what condition, what attribute of wilderness? Wildness. So that's an important concept. Let's look at this word. First, the root word. What's the root word for wilderness? Anyone? Well, wild, she says. Well, that's close, but go deeper. The root word is actually will, and that refers to the area being self-willed, or as Bob Marshall wrote, free from human will. It's free from human will, not necessarily from human effect, which is what naturalness is supposed to be. So, untrammeled refers to wildness. This untrammeled wildness can be defined as the condition or state of a landscape characterized by its freedom from the human intent to alter, control, manipulate its components and ecological and evolutionary processes. So wildness is a state wherein those processes of an area's genesis are allowed to shape its future, free from human purpose, utility, and design. So notice in this definition, though, untrammeled wildness is free from human intent. It does not say free from human effect. That's what naturalness is or is supposed to be. This is the quality most central to the Wilderness Act. And every time you're presented with one of those problematic wilderness decisions, you should ask yourself, does this proposal represent our will or deference to the landscape's evolutionary will? So let's take a look at this. Had the Wilderness Act defined wilderness as an area that's just wild, it would be inclusive only of areas that humans haven't had a reason to, or the means to subjugate. Well, such areas would be expiring, but they don't connect us to that moral vision of human-Earth relations underlying the Wilderness Act, because they don't require anything of us. So what untrammeled is, it's two things. It's first about this condition of a landscape, those free-functioning ecological evolutionary processes we mentioned, but it's also a relationship to a landscape. It's a relationship of respect for and deference to these processes. And some people have problems understanding wilderness as both a physical condition and a relationship, but that's the nature of the wilderness. So let's look at a practical question here. Given this untrammeled character of wilderness, is it permissible or appropriate to shoot a wolf in wilderness? Well, some people say no, But it is one of those many questions that depends on the intent. If your intent is just hunting, yes, it is permissible and appropriate. However, if the intent is predator control to manipulate populations for our benefit, it's impermissible. In this way, our agencies are at variance with the state of Alaska on this, the state having more of a focus on sustained harvest of game animals, but that philosophy is not appropriate within wilderness. So moving on to the Wilderness Act, it says wilderness is an area without permanent improvements, and it's protected and managed so as to preserve natural conditions. Well, let's look at those human improvements that are not permissible in wilderness. There's one, not permissible. It's an improvement. So what's wrong with that? Does it trammel the landscape? Well, many people think it does, but again, it doesn't affect the ecological integrity of the area. So a ranger cabin in itself is not legal, it's not permissible because of development, but not because it doesn't trammel the area, but because it's an improvement or a development. Let's look at a couple other things that help illustrate this idea. Now, this isn't a refuge in the lower 48, it's not a wilderness area, but would this pond, this artificially made pond for waterfall, would that be appropriate in wilderness? No. Why not? Because it's a trammeling. It changes the ecological conditions, bringing water into a landscape, concentrating wildlife there. It's a trammeling and will be impermissible in wilderness. How about this? Is this permissible in wilderness? Well, what this is, it's a bunch of boulders across a creek, a small creek. So whether it's permissible in wilderness or not depends on, one of those things depends on the intent of the action. If the intent of placing these boulders here was to change the ecology of this stream, perhaps make the water a little deeper upstream, that would be entirely impermissible. If the intent was to enable hikers to cross here without getting their feet wet, that wouldn't be permissible. But if the intent was to enable recreational use, but to, say, prevent a trampling in the substrate in the water, affect the hydrology, or perhaps to prevent the stream bank from being eroded by hikers, then it would be permissible. So it's one of those many things in wilderness stewardship where the permissibility depends on the intent of the stewarding agencies. So we mentioned the Wilderness Act says wilderness is to be managed, protected to preserve its natural conditions. So this question is, and really important in wilderness today, what is the natural condition that we are mandated to preserve in wilderness? It could be one of two things. Is it some baseline point in time, for example, pre-European contact, pre-Wilderness Act, or pre-designation? Or is the natural condition a condition that results from the unhindered adaptation to large-scale changes like climate change, regardless of the degree to which those changes are anthropogenic? Well, that hasn't been decided, and agencies sometimes make wilderness decisions based on one or the other. But more and more we're realizing that some baseline point in time is not a good descriptor of naturalness. So the question often is, if we want to maintain wilderness in some baseline point at time, what could we do? Well, what the agencies do, and what Fish and Wildlife Service is quite masterful at doing in lower 48 refuges, is to have ecological interventions. And some examples in lower 48 refuges are habitat manipulation, manipulation of the hydrological system, and so on. Now, are these permissible in wilderness? Generally not. But it's important that we recognize that it is inevitable that there be more and more calls for hands-on management, manipulations, and interventions and restoration efforts at all scales. And this is the biggest threat to wildness. So this illustrates an important point about this provision. Is this permissible in wilderness? Cutting trees? You say, well, obviously not. But is this permissible in wilderness? A beaver cut down the tree. Well, of course it is. And this just simply illustrates the point that it's not the ecological effect, but rather it's whether human intent is involved to alter or change the landscape. Moving on to the Wilderness Act definition. Wilderness is to remain unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness. And notice it says future use and enjoyment. That includes on-site use, also enjoyment by people who find enjoyment in just knowing the area exists. So let's take a look at impairments. Obviously, an overused campground is an impairment. But also, in the Arctic Refuge, an example of an impairment is a landing strip that has eroded due to excessive use. So given that, to meet this requirement to leave an area unimpeded, should the wilderness manager call in the firefighters to put this fire out? Well, that, again, is one of those it depends questions that characterizes wilderness. If it's lightning caused, in other words, natural ignition, no, we should leave this to burn. But there are exceptions, and where community health or communities are involved or special resources, it may be permissible to put this fire out. And that brings us to another provision. This is not part of the definition of wilderness, but the Act has a number of exceptions, this being a main one. It says such measures may be taken when they're necessary to control fire, insects, and diseases. Now, the standard of necessity here isn't very high. Later in the Act, we'll see where some things are permissible where they are necessary for the purpose of the Wilderness Act, that is to preserve wilderness character. But here it doesn't say that. Fire control is allowed just if it's necessary. So when would it be necessary? Well, if it threatens high-value resources or communities and so on. So moving on to the Wilderness Area Act, a very interesting phrase. It describes wilderness as an area that's both undeveloped, retaining its primeval character and influence. So let's look at what the word undeveloped refers to. Obviously, that's a development unpermissible in wilderness. So is that. Is that development permissible in wilderness? No. Not unless the wording in the signage is necessary to protect the area as wilderness. And these are not permissible in wilderness. They are not necessary to steward the area as wilderness. So sometimes there's a question is asked, well, what if there's a structure? What if there's an interpretive sign before the area was designated? Is it permissible to leave it within the wilderness? And no, it isn't. There's no grandfather clause in the Wilderness Act. Just because a structure or some kind of improvement existed before designation does not mean it should exist in wilderness now. So among the interesting phrases is the Wilderness Act's primeval character and influence. So primeval character refers to, it's a very evocative word. It refers to a time before civilization, before first human contact. It's when humans were an inseparable part of the natural world. Primeval influence refers to the experience you might have, experiencing conditions that once formed and shaped us as a species. So in primeval areas, you might gain a sense of where the world was, how it felt for 99% of human history. Now, the Wilderness Act specifies, this is not part of the definition, but it specifies wilderness is devoted to these public purposes. And this sometimes causes confusion because these should not be confused with the purpose. of wilderness. Anytime the word wilderness, a purpose of wilderness is used in the Act, it refers to preserving wilderness character. These public purposes are more like public uses, and they are secondary to that primary purpose of wilderness, maintaining wilderness character. I'm just going to comment on one of these public purposes of wilderness, and that is the scientific value of wilderness. Wilderness was intended to be a living museum of how nature functions when it's left alone. So moving on in the definition of wilderness area has outstanding opportunities for either solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. So let's take a look at that. Solitude first. Solitude is more than just isolation, privacy, and being away from different groups. Our wilderness policy for Fish and Wildlife Service defines it as a state of mind, a mental freedom that arises when you're away from the reminders of society, when you're away from distractions like this, many people. This isn't permissible in wilderness. Now, how about this? Does this impinge on solitude? Well, yes, it does, according to the definition that we use. And such a campground marker or so on is not permissible in wilderness. So, recreation. Recreation is an important part of wilderness, but we need to remember the word recreation only occurs twice in the Wilderness Act. And it's really a wholly insufficient term for the kind of experience that was to be available here. So let's look at the experience, the wilderness experience, and consider some of the attributes of this landscape that are conducive to it. Some are tangible and some not. So like many people today, George Schauler found this area in the Arctic Refuge to be a place of solitude, introspection, self-reflection, and restoration. And, that's a theme that just resonates through the wilderness literature. And Sandy Jamieson here is one of the Arctic Refuge visitors who knows the experience that should be available to wilderness visitors. Now, Sandy's a hunter, and he's got a plane. He says he could hunt in other areas of the state that have more game. So the kind of connection he finds here is really a spiritual experience of the type that a transcendent type experience that many people experience in wilderness, although few can express it as well as Sandy Jamieson. Agencies shouldn't be squeamish about using the spiritual word for this type of experience. But for sure, wilderness was intended to be an adventuring ground. It was to be the antithesis of the commercial and convenience-oriented tourism that national parks were promoting at the time the Wilderness Act was being debated. As Olaus Murie said, this was to be a place for challenge and self-reliance, hardships, even risk that sometimes isn't enjoyed at the time, but you look back and it's among the defining elements of the trip. And that reminds us that the experience in wilderness is more than just 1 or 2, maybe 3 weeks spent on site. It's also in the story that one takes home that becomes part of who you are. It's a flow experience, and it's so described because after a few days, when you're free of the clock, free of the calendar, free of pressure to conform, one feels as if they're just being carried away by the flow. For most people, it takes several days for the outside world to kind of loosen its grasp on their mind. And that often includes stories about bears in the Arctic Refuge anyway, even if you don't see one. Their tracks remind you of your littleness. They remind you that you don't dominate this landscape. And we should remember that there can be no adventure without some element of what? What quality must the agency maintain in this area to perpetuate the experience of adventure? Well, it's the sense of unknown. This sense of unknown. What lies ahead, what lies around the next horizon, around the bend, or it can be the unknown of what within. Can I find my way? Can I do that? And there are many unknowns in experience in wilderness. Water level is one of them. In the Arctic, this couple may have arrived expecting a leisurely float down this river, but instead, for miles and miles, their experience was a drag. And a defining element of their experience was endurance. So this intrigue of what lies around the next bend or over the horizon is part of a sense of mystery. That elusive but compelling aura. There's something beyond. There's something you have to search out here yourself. And so in wilderness, there shouldn't be any improvements. And in Arctic Refuge, for example, there are no trails. There are no signs pointing the way anywhere in the Arctic Refuge, because for every management action that would reduce the uncertainty, that would make your experience, more predictable, more convenient, more safe, something of the original wilderness experience would be lost. And that's implicit in the interpretive materials that we do provide to prospective visitors who write or call us, ask us about visiting the refuge. This is what they're told. And consistent with the values of this place for which it was established, the Arctic Refuge, there aren't any trails, signs pointing the way. You'll find that we have no brochures that suggest routes or plan travel routes or anything. We don't have anything that rates rivers or river crossings, identifies places to cross them. The features aren't featured in wilderness, and we don't publish where to go, what to do, what to think stuff. And so this is all part of what makes your wilderness experience, your connection to the landscape here is so genuine. And so the message that we give is, do come to the wilderness, but come prepared, both mentally and physically, and come as a guest to this place. Come willing to yield your uses and your conveniences to its presence. So getting back to the Wilderness Act, how do we perpetuate these wilderness values? Well, through prohibitions. Now, there are two altogether entirely prohibited things in the Wilderness Act, and that is there'll be no permanent roads and no commercial enterprises. There are no exceptions for this in the Wilderness Act. So, could say, for example, the Secretary of Interior authorize a road in wilderness? No, they can't. The only way you could have a road within wilderness is to cherry stem it in other words, to segregate out the road from the wilderness, or to make a land trade. But the Wilderness Act has no exceptions for permanent roads. Now, I couldn't find a good picture of commercial enterprise in wilderness because there aren't any, but commercial enterprises are not allowed in wilderness. In other words, you could not have a hot dog stand. You can't do commercial forestry and so on. But commercial enterprises does not include commercial guiding, that is hunting guiding or recreational guiding, which is different than a commercial enterprise. So now let's look at what the Wilderness Act is perhaps best known for, and that is its Section 4C prohibitions. Section 4C of the Wilderness Act says there may be no temporary roads in wilderness, no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment, or motorboats. That's no ice augers, no snow machines, motorboats, for example, generators, no landing of aircraft, no forms of mechanical transport, which includes bicycles, no structures or installations, that is developments, except And the thing about the Section 4C of the Wilderness Act is there are exceptions. And two general categories, as far as us in Alaska are concerned, and that includes the ANILCA exceptions. And as we all know, ANILCA did not amend the Wilderness Act, but it simply states that within the wilderness, designated wilderness, a number of these are permissible. We still can't have temporary roads, but we can use snow machines, motor boats, and aircraft in Alaska wilderness. We still can't have structures or installations. However, there are more than just the Alaska exceptions, and that is the Section 4C allowance that says those prohibitions may be considered necessary to meet the minimum requirements for administration of the area for the purpose of this act, which is the singular purpose of wilderness, to maintain wilderness character. So, to determine if a proposed action meets this high standard of necessity, we do what's called a minimum requirements analysis. Now, we have a separate training program on that. I'm not going to get into the details. But basically, it's used to determine whether a proposed action meets the high standard of necessity. Now for the quiz. I didn't tell you a quiz was coming, but to see if you've been paying attention, this is a very easy quiz. It's a one-question, one-word answer quiz, and that is, according to the Wilderness Act, the intent of the Act, wilderness should be a place of what? If you had just one word to complete this sentence as Olafsmiri would, what would you say? What would wilderness mean to future generations? Anybody know? Want to guess? Lady in the back? What Olaf would have said, what he has said many times, is a place of restraint. So why that? Well, we need to remember that the Wilderness Act was about three main things, and everybody knows it was about protecting the landscape and the kind of experience you could have there. Wilderness was also about maintaining those natural processes where, in the wording of the Wilderness Act, they're untrammeled and wild. But we should also remember that wilderness was intended to be about us, about exercising that better part of us, willing to restrain ourselves. Wilderness is an encouraging demonstration and reminder of our capacity to restrain our immediate uses, interests, and profits. So the thought of the founders of the Wilderness Act, the framers of the Act, was this, that we enlarged as a people when we set places apart, and not just for the uses or the benefits they might provide us, but also for how they might enable us to see ourselves as part of a larger community in the larger scheme of things. And that was a grounding of the American wilderness movement, and not coincidentally, it's the grounding, the spiritual grounding of all spiritual traditions. So we need to remember, and what we often recognize is that, among other things, wilderness is a place where we restrain technology. And it's not just because of the physical impacts or that technologies might cause, that they might leave a scar, squish plants, or cause a disturbance, was not the only concern of the framers of the Wilderness Act. Rather, they also realized that every technology expresses a set of values, has a worldview built into it. Its use, even its presence, alters one's experience of and relationship to a landscape. And I'll give you a couple examples from my experience as a wilderness coordinator with this. Example is a generator. In 1985, I was going to fly a group of biologists out to do some research. And I went to the hangar the day before with them to look at all the gear and figure out how many trips it would take. And I noticed a generator among their gear ready to be flown out. And I asked, what's that for? And the biologist said, well, it's going to power hot showers. And they had a few other uses for the generator that certainly weren't necessary in wilderness. And so I told them, well, I can't fly that generator out for you because it's not permissible in wilderness. And of course, they didn't like the idea. And they argued, as they often do, and said, well, first, nobody will see it. And this is going to be late winter. Nobody will see it. So let's do it. And they said, well, that somebody might see it is not a criteria of the Wilderness Act. So that's not a factor. And then the usual argument, well, it won't hurt nothing, so I'll bring it. And it's, well, that's also not a criteria of the Wilderness Act, that technology might hurt something. The Wilderness Act intent is that we recognize that sometimes we forgo technology for no reason other than as a gesture of respect for what wilderness represents. Well, in that case, the biologist appealed it to the manager. I explained what the Wilderness Act said, its intent, and basically the group went without the generator. So this kind of concept is something that Marty Murray often spoke to. True, our policies, our management plans don't use this parlance, but this is the sentiment underlying the Wilderness Act, and we shouldn't be squeamish about it. So to kind of conclude here, the attitude that she expressed is embodied in this overarching mandate of the Wilderness Act, and that is to preserve the area's wilderness character. So let's look one more time at exactly what that is. Wilderness character includes those untrammeled wild quality, undeveloped quality, the natural quality, the solitude and primitive recreation you can find in wilderness, and the symbolic meanings that wilderness holds. So wilderness character can be defined as embodying both the tangible and intangible dimensions of wilderness. It's a combination of the biophysical conditions, experiential opportunities, and the symbolic meanings that distinguish wilderness from other lands. So an area possesses wilderness character to varying degrees, and that's to the degree that it first remains untrammeled and natural with undeveloped conditions. Second, that it provides opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. And thirdly, its stewardship upholds these notions of respect, restraint, humility, and obligation in our relationship to the land. But for Alaska especially, there's another component of wilderness character I want to mention that's not found in the Wilderness Act. And I first gained insight into this from my friend, the Reverend Dr. Tremble Gilbert, who is a prominent spiritual leader among the Gwich'in people. He's a supporter of wilderness, leader of the communities. I first hired him as a local hire in the early 1980s, and Tremble and I used to fly around the refuge a lot. One time, I remember on this trip, we were at Red Sheep Creek, and I asked Tremble, how do the Gwich'in see this landscape? And he was familiar generally with the wilderness perspective, so I asked him how the Gwich'in see it. And he supported wilderness, but he said that wilderness perspective I brought was different than the Gwich'in people's. And he said, he says, Roger, you'll never really understand it. But he tried to explain it as this. And that's what he sees in this landscape. It's interesting. It's a scientific view, really, but he understood that for hundreds of generations of his ancestors died, buried, their bodies became part of this landscape, and when he hunts caribou, it's a symbolic act of taking those ancestors into his body. So that's, for many Gwich'in, that's how they view this landscape. And it's a wonderfully adapted cosmology, ideology, worldview about humans' proper relationship to the land, wildlife, and the earth. And so if you can accept that wilderness is more than just a condition of the landscape, but it's also a kind of relationship we have with it, then you can understand why we at the Arctic Refuge consider this rich Indigenous history and this continuing relationship they struggle to maintain as a wilderness value of the Arctic Refuge. In fact, as a part of the refuge's wilderness character. So how do we do that? Well, for example, partly through policies and, in fact, our comprehensive conservation plan. We make statements like this that recognizes And we try to capture in words what people from these communities have been telling us for a long time. Another way at Arctic Refuge is that we give visual expression through art to what people have been telling us. We've contracted with an artist, Lindsay Karen in this case, to convey visually what Native people have been telling us, that they're an integral part of this landscape and in fact intertwined with it. It's a touchstone to their past and a part of their identity. So just in conclusion here, I'll just say that I think one of the challenges of wilderness stewardship in Alaska is to find ways of recognizing, learning from, and incorporating those aspects of the Native worldview and their values that offer an alternative to our dominant Western worldview that's pushing us into this Anthropocene exponential age. Because I think both wilderness values and Indigenous values have something to offer as we search for a way of entering into a sustainable relationship with this finite and conflicted Earth system that we share.